a lot of the research that I did, a lot of it with Simon Johnson and James Robinson. And some of that work is about understanding where institutions come from, their institutional persistence, why institutions change sometime, like why did democracy emerge in some places and not in others, why was it consolidated in some places and others. But a very important part of it, and also not unrelated to some of the issues that we're talking about today in the turbulent times, is about stable institutions, rule of law, checks against the power of people. How do these things influence economic growth? And that's what we started exploring. And sort of the big idea, if you can call it that, was to look for changes in one of the most important events of the last 500 years, European colonial expansion, which reshaped the institutional arrangements around the world in deep ways. And then we developed a simple theory about why that didn't have a uniform effect. In fact, questions like what did colonialism do impose a uniformity that doesn't exist. Some of the countries that have, according to most of the measures we have, the best institutions are former European colonies, and some of the ones that have, many of the ones that have the worst institutions are former European colonies. So there was a huge institutional divergence. And then we try to explain that by saying, look, Europeans used very different colonization strategies, not by choice, sometimes by necessity, because some of their initial plans didn't work out. And we identified, settlements, especially the existence of a lower strata of Europeans who could stand up to some of the impositions like they did in Jamestown or other North American colonies or in Australia, as a key factor. But of course, whether people went and settled there is a highly endogenous thing. They might go and settle in very different places. Lots of Brits went and settled in Barbados, not to form better institutions, but because they were the slave owners, and Barbados was the richest part of the world at the time. So then we looked at one of the factors that really mightily influenced that, which is the mortality rates. Europeans had no immunity and no understanding of diseases like malaria, yellow fever, or even most of the gastrointestinal diseases. Some of the places like New Zealand, Australia, were healthier than Europe, and some of the places, including parts of the Caribbean, Indian subcontinent, etc., and especially Africa, were much, much healthier. Mortality rates that were so high that would shock people today, but shocked the people at the time. So Europeans knew that they didn't want to go and settle there. So that was the sort of the approach. Use this natural experiment of history. Europeans come into contact with diseases they're not accustomed to. That leads to a divergence that then and we sort of try to identify the impact of institutions, especially these sorts of secure property rights, more constrained institutions, etc., from that channel.
When you look around the world today, is there a particular country or set of countries that you particularly admire for their institutions?
Right now, none.
That's depressing.
I can tell you many places where, look, I mean, I think there are many countries that have, over time, done many very interesting experiments. I think the key here is that when you think about institutions, and I think Hayek also had this view, you have to have a much more dynamic, you need to change. The institutions will have to change because our social conditions are changing. So I think for a while, the social democratic system in Scandinavia, in Nordic countries, let's include Finland in there as well, actually worked very well. And I think it still has a lot that is working much better than the rest of the world. And it's not having quite the same difficulties as the United States is having. I think Canada is doing very well. US for a while was doing very well, but this is one of the themes that James Robinson and I emphasize in the narrow corridor. US institutions from the beginning had some weaknesses, and I think we're now seeing those weaknesses coming apart at the seams.
What were those weaknesses in particular?
So I think federal power was always very weak, and then when it expanded by necessity, it expanded in a way that wasn't organically checked. So you had a little bit of the worst of both worlds.